Season 2 of the Raise 'em Up podcast. I'm Heath Cole, and I am returning today. I'm flying solo. But today we're going to talk about how many things start at home. And we oftentimes talk about the behavioral issues with kids, and I have to admit that when I talk about a lot of the issues that I talk about, I'm talking about kids that are in their teens or preteens when they're starting to develop some negative behaviors that parents have a hard time dealing with. But really, when you raise them up right at the very early stages, a lot of those problems vanish. They just don't ever tend to appear. It starts at home, though. We have to start from a very early age. I am constantly amazed by the feeling that we have more time than we do to teach our kids certain things. Responsibility doesn't start at 10 or 12. Responsibility starts at 2 or 3. And as parents, we have to start factoring that into how we raise our kids. And it's a little bit difficult, but not overly so. What can a 2-year-old handle? Well, can a 2-year-old handle sitting nicely through a meal? Can a 2-year-old handle not throwing things while we're eating? Well, that depends on the parents. If parents are willing to say, you know what, we don't act like that, and we all sit nicely, and to teach those, and really stress them verbally, but also stress them through the actions of the parent, then kids will start picking up on that very quickly and start saying, we don't do that at dinner. If you take my family and you take my kids and you take them somewhere, they're going to have a certain set of behaviors that go with how they were raised, and not 100% of them are exactly what I intended or what their mother intended, but they can be traced back to growing up, and it started really early with them, whether it's being able to handle going out to eat or whether it's being able to handle going to a movie. Kids can learn really easily when the expectations are clear. It's when the expectations aren't clear that it becomes really challenging for kids. If you don't know what's expected and you just are behaving based on your reactions to everything and nobody sets those expectations, then how can you possibly think that it's going to be wrong? Well, a lot of times this boils down to you usually got a car ride before something happens. Car ride to go somewhere, car ride to go out to eat, car ride to go to parents' house, whatever you're doing. That car ride can be used to set those expectations. When we get to grandma's house, we're going to do this, or we don't do this, or even things like, grandpa doesn't hear so well, so you may want to speak up. Kids can handle that. And yes, telling a 2-year-old that they might want to speak up for grandpa doesn't really feel like you're doing the right thing. But in the end, as you repeat that over and over, every time you go to grandpa's house, it becomes something that becomes trained into the child. They start saying, oh, I have to elevate my voice for grandpa, or grandma expects me to help clean up after the meal, or whatever those expectations are. As parents, we can set them all the time. For me, there was a few things that were pretty important. My kids will tell you there was a bunch of things, but for me, there was just a few things that were really important. One of those was being able to be somewhat self-contained when we went somewhere. If you're ever in a situation where the adults have to have their focus on something, you know that the kids can get pretty unruly if they're not in a position where they can be self-contained, self-managed, self-soothed. And so teaching that requires a lot of words. And I wish that I could tell you it was just some weird thing you could pass on to your kids telepathically, but it doesn't work that way. What works is to sit down and have those conversations. For me, when my kids were real young, like 2 and 3 years old, a lot of times I would sit down with them and I would just put my big old hands over their little old hands, which kept the hands from moving and kept the conversation from getting out of hand. But it also soothed them to know that I was going to be helping them manage their behavior. And my wife is really good about this. She will oftentimes hold the hands of the kids when she wants to make a point or when she really wants to get a message across. And that becomes a soothing thing. And if you do it every time that you want to have those conversations, then that becomes a built-in expectation. And you can do this with literally everything. From sitting down at the table before we eat, one of the expectations that I tend to have is that I don't like to eat unless everybody's eating. Doesn't mean I don't eat alone. It just means if we're all in the house, I don't like 8 different meals going on at one time. I prefer everybody sit down and we all eat together and the conversation starts at the same time and ends at the same time, and that it's just a family event. Well, that expectation started off when they were young. I didn't say a lot about it. I just would wait and eat until everybody was ready. Those little things are a part of it. And as we get into what's an unknown for a school year, it's important that you recognize you have all of these expectations that are kind of wacky a little bit right now. And kids are kind of having to manage how they feel about all that and how to manage all of the things that are changing and what's school going to look like next year. And as parents, if we teach that we can always sit down and go in our head a little bit and talk about those expectations, and get them from inside of us into outside of us using our words, then kids can start saying, okay, this is what's going to be expected and I can handle that. And also the parents can start saying, okay, you know what? We're all going to pitch in and help each other out for this time because it's a little bit different than it was last year. Well, as a family, come together around those expectations and then life gets easier for everybody. I don't really know how the next few years are going to work. If you listen to the experts, it sounds like we're going to be changing the way we do things for a little while. And if that's the case, one of the things we can do is we can start refocusing the relationship we have with our kids to be centered around setting clear, clean expectations, and for really challenging ourselves to say, I'm going to be the main teacher in my child's life, because right now Zoom calls and virtual meetings and school 2 days a week, all of those things are very abnormal for kids' thought processes and for their belief systems and for everything they've known up to this point. And so being able to self-soothe, to tell yourself it's going to be okay, to remind yourself you don't have to react negatively to everything that happens. Well, that starts with us. That starts with parents that are able to do that. And all you got to do is talk about it when you do it. Somebody cuts you off in traffic. You can actually have the conversation out loud about how you talk yourself out of being frustrated about it. Ooh, I didn't like that guy pulling in front of me, but I don't have to react to that. I'm just going to let him go and I'm not going to let it affect my day. When you say those things out loud, kids hear them and then they start doing the same thing for themselves. But if they never see anybody do it, why would they do it? I mean, you don't just develop these habits in a vacuum. So I encourage you to say it out loud. Set those expectations. Doesn't matter how young the kid is. You can talk about it. You can talk about washing your hands before you eat. You can talk about washing your hands after you eat. You can talk about all of those things. One thing that I found is really helpful is everybody goes to the bathroom before we leave to get in the car to go on a trip more than 5 minutes. Well, pretty soon, everybody's kind of in the habit, though, every time we got to go somewhere, they just run to the bathroom and go before we go, and then it's a much smoother process. And I don't think parents are afraid to do this or can't do this. What I think happens is the monotony or the drudgery of doing it over and over and over again starts to control our behavior. And so if we're teaching our kids that if something has to be done over and over again, it's not worth doing, then they're going to adopt that. If we show them every day that we're going to repeat our expectations, we're going to repeat what we expect out of the situation, and we're going to repeat those things over and over again every time we go into the store. I'm going to say, it could be it's like a little pep talk. We're going to the grocery store. We're going to be going to these things. We're going to get these things. We're going to get into the self-checkout and we're going to get out of there. If you just describe that before you go in, kids are like, oh, okay, I know what to expect. And we all do better when we know what to expect. 8 to 80. If you know what to expect, life gets a lot simpler and more predictable and easier to navigate. And as a parent, if the one thing you can do for your child is always make life a little bit easier to navigate, it is so worth it. So thank you for joining us on the Raise 'em Up podcast. We'll be back with another episode later in the week or next week or whenever it comes out.